All right, our next unit is on natural selection or survival of the fittest. We'll be learning about how populations of organisms change over very long periods of time. So, before we begin, we have to talk about Charles Darwin. So, like how Gregor Mendel is the father of genetics, Charles Darwin is the father of evolution. Now, evolution is a theory. Remember from the beginning of the year, we talked about how we have hypotheses, which are here, then we have theories, and we have laws. Laws are like the closest we can get to fact in science, although it's pretty hard to say something is a fact in science because things change all the time. Okay, the next step down is a theory, meaning we have a lot of evidence that supports it. However, it is not a law, it is not fact. And lower than that, we have a hypothesis, which is a potential answer to a question. We make hypotheses often in science. So the level of evolution is at the theory level. Okay. So now Charles Darwin, he was a naturalist. Okay. He was a botanist. He studied flowers and plants. He sailed on a boat called the HMS Beagle from England, and this was a 5-year voyage. Okay, so it took a very long time. They sailed across the Atlantic Ocean on the southern coast of South America. And the most important part about this trip is that the Beagle, this boat that he was on, arrived at the Galapagos Islands. And these islands have some pretty cool animals. So let's look a little bit at the Galapagos. This would be a really cool place to visit. So it's a group of 16 islands west of South America. They're actually part of Ecuador. Okay. Now, each of the islands here has slightly different climates. And as we learn through natural selection, different climates can lead to different traits that we see in animals. Okay, so like I said, the animals on each island are unique and have really cool characteristics. Okay, so some of those are going to be tortoises that we'll talk about, iguanas, and finches. Okay, so now let's start with the tortoises. There are 3 different islands of the Galapagos where we see 3 different looking tortoises, but we believe that they all originated from a common ancestor. Okay, now when you look at these 3 pictures, what do you notice that is different? Well, you might say the necks of the tortoises look to be different lengths. Okay, so we have the short neck tortoises, there's kind of an intermediate, and then a long neck tortoise. Now, when you look at the vegetation of these different areas, we see that the short necked tortoises have vegetation and grasses that are close to the ground that they eat. Okay, then the taller neck tortoises have taller bushes and shrubs that they're eating from. Okay, so you can see that they have an advantage in the place that they're living. They're able to get the food the best. And whereas we would assume that the intermediate um, neck length has some intermediate food source as well. So he started to notice that organisms are fit to their environment or they have traits that match their environment and help them survive. Okay, there's some vocabulary we need to know as we get into this. First, we need to know what a species is. A species it would be organisms that breed with one another, and they can pass on their DNA to produce fertile offspring. So write that one down. Okay, we also need to know what biological fitness means, and that is an organism's ability to pass on DNA to its offspring. So, in nature, fitness isn't like working out at the gym, okay? It's passing on your genetics. That is the ultimate goal of animals in nature. So, the more offspring they have, the more fit they are. This is biological fitness. It has nothing to do with how strong the organism actually is. Okay, and then we have adaptation. An adaptation is a trait that helps an organism survive or reproduce in its environment. Okay, so for example, the tortoises had an adaptation of their neck length, helped them survive and reproduce in their environment. Okay, now it's very important to note that organisms are born with these adaptations. They cannot change their traits to fit the environment. Sometimes we talk about this and we say, well, the organism adapted to the environment. No, they were born with the adaptation. Right? So they didn't change over their lifetime. They were born with this adaptation that happened to be fit to their environment. Okay. We can also talk about this with the Galapagos finches. Okay. So you can see the image here. What do you notice that is different about the birds themselves? You might say that the shape of their beaks are different. Okay. So you can see the first one on the very left has a thicker beak, and this is for cracking open large seeds. Okay. So the beak type helps that bird eat the food that is found in its environment. Whereas the cactus finch, the second one from the left, it has a pointier beak and it allows it to get the fruit of the cactus. Okay, so each of these birds is able to pick up and eat the food that it's suited for in its environment. Okay. So now we need to define what natural selection is. This is a term that you're really going to need to know. You're going to need to have memorized. So natural selection is when organisms are born with traits that are better adapted to their environment. Those organisms will survive and reproduce more successfully than others. So if they are born with the better traits, they will survive and reproduce more. Makes sense, right? Okay, we also call this survival of the fittest. This acts on a range of phenotypes. If you remember what a phenotype is, it's physical characteristic of the organism, what the organism looks like. And it acts on phenotypes of a population over long periods of time. This isn't something that happens to individuals in their lifetime. Okay, this is something that we see in populations as some organisms survive and some die because they don't have the traits that are good for their environment. Okay, and then please define population, which is all members of a species that live in an area. Okay, now let's look at some examples of natural selection. So you can see in the image we have a bird and then we have some mice of different colors. Okay, you can probably tell which mouse is better adapted to the environment. The environment has a dark color, so the dark colored mouse is, well, camouflaged. It's better adapted. It has the ability to survive and reproduce over time. So when we look at the image on the right, there are more dark colored mice, less light colored mice, because the birds, the predators, could see the light colored mice in that environment and they ate them. So the organism with the most fitness is the dark colored mice. Alrighty. And here's again that example of the finches with the different beak types. So they are fit to their environment and the food that they eat. Basically, if you have the beak type that suits the food that's in the area, you will survive and reproduce and pass on that trait to the next generation. Now, what is evolution? Maybe you've heard of this before, but it's actually a pretty simple definition. Evolution is how living things change over long periods of time. And this creates new phenotypes or characteristics. Okay, now this happens over millions and millions of years. These changes do not happen overnight. But how do things change in the first place? This has something to do with what we talked about last unit. What causes genetic changes? DNA mutations. We have to change the actual DNA to change the trait. Okay, remember that changes in DNA are going to change the structure of a protein. Does this sound familiar to you? Okay, the structure of the protein, and proteins make up your traits. They make up your whole body. They are the workhorses of the human body and of other animals' bodies. So when we change the sequences of the DNA, the A's, T's, C's, G's, okay, we change our amino acid sequences, which change the protein, which change the organism's traits. Okay, so this is how we end up with differences among organisms and among the same species. Okay. Now, if a DNA mutation leads to a more beneficial trait, something that helps the organism, and this doesn't happen very often, but if it does, this will give the organism more fitness, okay, allowing them to survive and reproduce more than others. We're going to stop here and there will be a part 2.